Do you need $1 million to retire comfortably? That seems to be the debate that happens a lot. What we want to do is run some numbers for you. What do we do on this channel? Folks, we're a unique financial channel because there's nothing else like it on YouTube that I've seen. What we do is set up spreadsheets and run numbers for people to point out how different aspects, different financial concepts can affect your retirement. Things like sequence of returns risk. What about the impact of compound growth on your nest egg? How important is your asset allocation? What about the impact of inflation? What about the 4% withdrawal? We cover all kinds of different things. And folks, what we do in this channel is use actual historical returns for the last 100 years. And so let's go ahead and look at this scenario here. Do you really need $1 million? Let's say, for example, you're a couple, you're making $80,000 a year. One of the recommended criteria you need to do is 8 times your salary. You have that much, need to have that much saved up. So say you're making 80,000 a year, that would be $640,000. So let's say you've actually reached that goal. You're ready to retire. You got 640,000. Now you're used to making 80,000 a year, but do you need that much in retirement? I've heard everything you need anywhere from 60% of your your normal wage in retirement to 75 or down to 60%. Let's just do 75%. So in other words, that'd be 60,000 a year. You're making 80,000. You're just going to need 5,000 in retirement because you're no longer paying into like Social Security, paying into retirement, things like that. So let's use these numbers. Also, I want to take into account Social Security. Let's say, for example, one spouse is making is going to get 1,800 a month. The other one's going to get 1,200 a month. We're going to simplify that 3,000 a month. That's at age 67. They want to say they're 62 and they want to retire at age 62. So they're instead of this 3,000 they get at age 67, they're going to get 70% of that. So they're going to get 2,100. So we're going to go ahead and say that they're going to take that from the very first year. They're 62 years old. What we're going to do is do a couple other things. Out of this 5,000, 2,100 is going to come from Social Security. So you're going to need 2,900 from your nest egg. Now we want to increase that by 3% a year to give you some kind of a COLA to try to keep up with inflation. We're also going to do an 80-20 asset allocation. We just can change any of these numbers, which means 80% stays in the S&P 500, so you can gain from these good when the market's going up. We also want to have a cash reserve account over here. So when the market's going down, you're taking these sums out of the cash reserve account. You don't want to be knocking down the S&P 500 even farther or quicker because you're taking what you need for living expenses out of the S&P 500. So what we want to do is run the numbers for every single year. Another thing we've taken into account is what's called, usually in your first decade of retirement, they're called the go-go years. So I've highlighted this, the first 10 years in green. Then you reach the second decade or the slow-go years when you don't spend quite as much. Maybe you're in your 60s here, maybe you're in your 70s here, and I can testify I'm 73 years old. We're spending less than we did when we were in our 60s. We're doing a little bit less traveling, maybe eating out a little bit less, just overall spending a little bit less money. We're going to do a 10% cut there, and then when you get to the third decade, those are called the no-go years. So the go-go, slow-go, and no-go. We're trying to be as realistic as we possibly can running these numbers. Also, what we want to do is whenever you have the markets going up and you got this cash reserve account, I'm starting it out with a bucket of 2 years, basically, well, looks like it's about 3 years of what you would need. Closer to 4 years, I guess, of what you would need in retirement. So that's putting 4 years worth of these initial expenses over in a bucket. So when the market's going down, you're taking out of there. So that's just going to be an 80-20 split. We also want to, when the market's going good, we're going to go ahead and put 25,000 out of that nest egg to keep replenishing that cash reserve account. So if you do run into some bad years, this cash reserve account's kind of getting built up before that with the good years. You can see it going down through there. So I hope you can see all these different variables that we can take into account to run numbers for people. Of course, nobody's going to be identical to this, but this is going to give us some idea. How often in the last 100 years, given all these different numbers, would you run out of money? So what we're going to do is go ahead and update this for the last 100 years just to see where somebody might be. How often would you run into problems? Would that 640,000 not be enough? I want you to notice 7% of the time in the last 100 years, How many entered the Depression years? Right back here, 19, 28, 29, and 30, 31 along in there. And also there's some times around the year 2000. Why? Because we're using these numbers right here. What actually happened in the last 100 years, this decade was kind of problematic. People say don't use the Depression years. That's never going to happen again. But I like to include all these possible variants. If it's happened in the last 100 years, we're going to look at it. But look, as recent year 2000, we had 4 down years in that decade, and that's why you ended up with a graph like this. We'd actually have problems given the scenario in the year 2000. Let me just go ahead and show you these numbers real quick. You can look at the Depression years, but let's go and look at year 2000. You're running out of money in 16 years given this scenario. Why? Because if you start out with 3 down years like you did in the year 2000, they call this sequence of returns risk. If that sequence of returns are negative when you first retire, it can really be a problem, as we see from these numbers in the year 2000 2002. You're going to be out of money in 16 years. What could you do differently? Let's just do this to show you a couple of variables here. Right now, we got a 5.44% withdrawal rate, which is quite a bit of the 4% recommended rule. What happens if we go from 5,000 down to 4,500? Now the money's lasting over 20 years. If we ever, again, this is rare to have 3 down years like this, but if you happen to have that, you might have to cut back from 5,000 down to 4,500. What's another thing you could do? Well, we've also given yourself a 3% COLA. What if you did a 2% COLA? Well, your money's still running out. How about a 1% COLA? Now finally your money's lasting. But what about if do the 3% COLA? But whenever there's down years, again, this takes a while. Again, you got money after 20 years. If after a down year you actually take, instead of a 3% COLA, you actually take what's called a negative COLA, you go down by 2%. Let me make sure this is right here. Yeah, you go down by 2%. So in other words, it's 3% in following good years, giving yourself a COLA, but taking a negative COLA in down years. How would that affect it? Now you can see your money's lasting. Did you catch that? Going from right here, running out of money in 20 years, to if you just did that little difference. In other words, that'd be a little bit of an adjustment to do, but look how it changes everything. Instead of you giving yourself that 3% COLA, again, you won't know that till after the year is done, but the very next year you take a minus 2% COLA. So in other words, if you're taking 2,400 out right here, you'd be taking 2,352. You just take 2% less than what you took the year before. Again, this is only following negative years in the return. Then your money lasts. Let's go ahead and update this and see if it affects the Depression years at all. I haven't run this in advance, so I don't know. It probably because the Depression years were so horrible, maybe it doesn't help that much. Oh, look at that. 0% of the time after 20 years do you run out of money. Let's look at the graph. Look at that. Just making that small little change from what you take your COLA, give yourself a 3% COLA after good years, but cut it to a negative 2% COLA. Yeah, it would be a little bit painful. Instead of getting a 3% raise, you'd take 2% less. But look, folks, that's what makes it work. That's what makes all these numbers work. Again, we went from 5,000 to 4,500 a month. Let's go back to the 5,000. Let's go ahead and run this one more time. See if that helps much even during the Depression years. Again, that $500 a month can make a difference. But this shows you how we can run all these different numbers. Do you really need $1 million to retire? In this case, we got somebody that has $640,000, and only 4% of the time in the last 100 years would you run into a problem. During the Depression years and a little bit around the year 2000, again, here's the year 2000, where you're running out of money in 19 years. Then you would have to cut back to the 4,500 right here. Then your money lasts. So again, if you start out, which is very rare to have consecutive down years when you first retire, that's the key. Look, 100 years worth of data. You had a 4-year stretch here where you had 4 down years. That caused problems. You also had a 3-year stretch right here from 1939 to 1941. 1973 and 74 were 2 down years, but it looks like you wouldn't run out of money there, and you wouldn't in this case either if you went back down to the 4,500 a month, or if you change this right here from a positive 3% COLA to a minus 2% COLA. Still in the year 2000, you have an issue, but go down to 4,500, you don't have that problem anymore. In year 2000, you would still have the problem with the depression type years right here. You're getting low around the year 2000. But folks, that's what we do on this channel. We run numbers. Do you really need $1 million? Say again, if you're making 80,000 a year, they say to save 8 times that. Okay, I've got 640,000. I do an 80-20 split. I take a 3% COLA. That's a 4.5% on 4,500. 5,000 a month is a little bit higher, 5.44, and that's why you run into problems just a few times staying with this 5,000 a month. That's when you run into problems with taking 5,000 a month and you have returns like the year 2000 to 2002. But every other scenario, we start changing any of these numbers. 4,500 salvages in many cases, taking a little bit less COLA, maybe a 2% COLA. Change your asset allocation. Let's go ahead and change the asset allocation. But let's go back to the 4,500. Again, this is what would happen if you had some down years initially. What happens if you do a 70-30 split? Do you think this 4% is going to go up or down or stay the same? Let's go ahead and run the numbers. 4,500. Look at that. 70-30 split. Now you don't run out of money. Again, that's a 4,500. Let's do one more thing at 5,000. I know I'm throwing a lot of things at you. That's a 5.44%. Or that's when I think you have some issues changing your asset allocation because, again, you're way above the 4%. Now you got a 4% failure rate. Pretty much what we had with the 80-20. But again, 3 additional down years, you might have to cut back a little bit from 5,000 down to 4,500. Take a negative COLA after negative years, and you can make this work in many cases. But most of the time, you're going to be just fine with these kind of numbers at the 5,000. It's only when you have these initial down years that you really run into problems. Folks, that's what we do. We run all kinds of different numbers on this channel, just using what's historically happened for the last 100 years and just showing you what the numbers might show you. Please consider subscribing to this channel. Please let people know about these numbers. Let them know about this channel that we run all kinds of different numbers. And don't think you have to have $1 million saved up before you can retire. Folks, we were running it as somebody was making $80,000 a year and in retirement just needed 75% of that. And it was 5,000 a month. And in most every case it worked. And if it doesn't the first couple of years, drop it back to 4,500. Yeah, that would hurt a little bit, but not near as much as you might think, and you can retire on this kind of money. Again, we were running Social Security. That just shows you all kinds of variables that we can do. We can change any of these numbers. We just love doing it. I just want to point out you don't need $1 million. I know I'm repeating myself, but too many people are working a lot longer than they need to try to get to $1 million when these kind of numbers may be just fine for you in almost every scenario. Thanks so much for watching.